A great deal about a cost inventory table or a cost table, and here's an example of one. You should also have access to this Excel spreadsheet in your folder. So at the very top, we try to explain what each of the columns are. So here in column A, you actually list the different cost components, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the fixed cost and the variable cost. And in column B is the actual cost of the thing that you're buying. Okay. And in column C, if you buy an item in bulk, how many of them are in that bulk item purchase? So for an example, you're not going to buy a bulk of buildings, or most likely not going to buy a bulk of refrigerators, but you're likely to buy a bulk of gloves or a bulk of screening kits, or order a bunch of pamphlets all at once. So you can see the difference in between the two. When you're buying stuff in bulk, how many are in this package in which you paid $1,000 for, how many are in this package which you paid $400 for. So that's what I mean by the number of items in this unit for this price. And then here is the number of units that's needed per patient or per activity. For the fixed item, it's going to be, for your activity. Are you going to buy one building, or are you going to buy one refrigerator, or you're going to only have rent for one building? Okay. For things that are in the variable cost, you may have more than one thing used. Like, for example, if a nurse is going to give a vaccination to a child, most likely they're going to use 2 gloves and not one. And so that's the difference that you see between the fixed and the variable cost. And then here is a very important item. It's column E. If the item is not used for the program 100% of the time, what percentage of the time is it being used? So real easy. If it is being used 100% of the time, then these numbers are just 1. Okay? Especially for the fixed cost. But most of the time, for example, in the building, you're not going to be using the whole building for some project. You may only need 2% of that building. So like a small room of that building. You have to determine what percentage of that building you're using. If you're only using 2% of that building, that's the number that goes here. Okay? Or you may be using the entire building, but the building is being used for multiple purposes. And so you may have a cancer building, and for a certain period of time, you're only doing screening for CV, cervical cancer. And so here, for example, if you're using that entire building maybe 25% of the time, then you put in 0.25. Okay? And so that's the number that you will put in here. And then in column F, it describes the useful life of the building. This is important so that we can get an accurate cost of durable items that you'll be using for your intervention. For most buildings, they usually have a useful life of like 30 years. So we normally put 30. But for things like refrigerators and other similar appliances of the small size, they can range anywhere from 5 to 15 years of their useful life. And so that's the number that you will put here. Okay. So once you have all this information in here for fixed costs, and very simply, fixed costs are items that are going to be used in your intervention, and that cost is not going to change no matter how many people that you see. If you see 0 people, you're still going to have this cost. If you see 1,000 people, you're still going to have this cost. In other words, you need this building to run your intervention. You're going to need the refrigerator. You're going to need utilities. No matter what, you're going to need this information. And so that's a general idea of what a fixed cost is. Okay, so once you put all this information into the table, here's the formula that automatically calculates how much cost these different components contribute to your program in 1 year. Okay, and so for example, for our building, the building costs, let's say $10,000 to build. You're only going to use one building. You're only going to use one of them. The building is going to be used 25% of the time. Either the space is going to be used 25%, 1% of the time, or you're occupying 25% space of that building. So either one of those is 25%. And the building has a useful life of 30. And then based upon the formula that's in this cell, it calculates what your cost is per year. Now, the one thing that you may notice is there's one more piece of information that's included in this formula, and that's this number right here, which is the societal rate. Okay? You may have seen this before in a number of papers. For example, in the US, we use a societal rate of 3%. This societal rate is probably equivalent to what should be used in South Africa, or I think maybe Bangladesh. Okay? And so how do you calculate the societal rate? It is based upon the government 30-year bond rate for the country. Okay? I don't want to go into detail as far as where to find this. You can talk to your local economist about it, or we can have a bigger discussion about it. But that's the rate that you should be using to help you estimate what the cost will be for these items, for your fixed items within a year.